true Christians should educate themselves and should gain a listening ear for some of just the small throwaway lines, the confusion that's thrown in, the statements that are made with nothing backing them up.
I mean, I think that
Mhm.
you're uniquely positioned to be able to look out into culture and say, hey, these are the things we need to be concerned about. And you mentioned trends, and you mentioned that there are things that churches can take steps to be on their guard about. What are you seeing right now in our culture where you're going, oh, this is a bad road? If these specific churches don't be on their guard and take steps and speak out against whatever these things are, this is
Mhm.
going to take them down a bad road. What are you seeing happen right now?
I think a lot of it is sort of I mean, just this sort of aesthetic language that is appearing. That maybe that's not a good word for it, but most lately, I've been really frustrated hearing people talk about how they embrace a biblical sexual ethic, and so therefore you should trust them. But they
Mm.
use, biblical sexual ethic with this sort of ginger, uh, anxious tone, like, or embarrassed. It's not a full-throated, wholesale, embrace and exposition of what it means to be a a person, and what sexuality is, and what the Bible is, and why what God says in the Bible about human sexuality is beautiful. It's instead there's this, well, yeah, we embrace it, but we just want to take two or three steps back. We're super apologetic. We're willing to say sorry for God being, I mean, we can't say he's a bigot, but we feel bad that he said these things. We know they're good, but we don't feel they're good. And we're not willing to um, stand up in a public space and say that they're beautiful.
Yeah, we're gonna call them
And
clobber passages.
yes, right, clobber passages. And we're going to say that parts of the Bible are abusive, or that God doesn't really understand women, or he does love you, but you're not going to feel loved by him because of these terrible texts of terror and clobber
Mm.
passages that are in there. And so that is the thing that makes me most concerned, because if you're going to feel embarrassed about the Bible, and you're not going to love what God commands, and you're not going to be able to account for difficult things like the conquest of Canaan or other violent acts, if you don't have any paradigm to understand um, sexual sin in the Bible and how it's used in the text, what it's for, then you're not going to survive the oncoming tsunami.
Mm.
And you're going to be the first to fall down. And I think we're seeing that right now. People are just kind of falling over before the tidal wave of the culture. And
Yeah.
that's tragic, because the scriptures are the words of life, and they always have been. They were the words of life 20 years ago, and 50 years ago, and 100 years ago, and when they were written. It's not like something changed just now. What changed is that we are embarrassed because we don't remember. They never spoke to us. I mean, I'm using us
Mhm.
not include myself here, but they
Yeah.
should speak to you. And if they don't speak to you in a way that you can hear and feel your life changed, then you aren't going to survive
Mm.
the coming apocalypse.
Mm. Okay, so you mentioned just at the very beginning of that answer something that brought to mind several conversations I've had with people where maybe there's an organization or a pastor or even a church who seems iffy on sexuality, and everybody's kind of like,
Mhm.
well, it sounds like they're promoting biblical marriage, but
Mhm.
then there's this other stuff where they're like okay with using pronouns and
Mhm.
calling
Mhm.
people gay or as an identity category. And then but I want to take it a little further, because then they'll say, well, but I wrote them, or I called them, or I spoke with somebody and I said, I have these concerns, X, Y, or Z. And then but they told me it's okay. We have a biblical sexual ethic. No worries.
Right.
And that was like good enough for them.
Mhm.
In
Right.
several of these conversations I've had, and it's like I want to say to everybody, that's nice, but you have to ask more questions. What
Mhm.
is the biblical sexual ethic? What does that
Mhm.
mean? What does that mean when it comes to who we are? What is our core identity? What is a sin? What isn't a sin? Where does sin begin? I mean, we are in the weeds of these
Mhm.
distinctions now. We cannot just kind of take someone's word for it. Oh yeah, yeah, no,
Mm-mm.
we have a biblical sexual ethic because um, everybody thinks that what they think is quote unquote biblical, or at least they want to say that it is. But
Mhm.
we have to ask more questions, don't we?
We have to ask so many questions, and we have to be, I think, theologically astute and nuanced enough to understand, to be able to hear what's being said when somebody says something, because there's layers and layers of meaning. And so there's ways that things can be communicated. And you're right, I think that people use that biblical sexual ethic as this wall that sort of should insulate them from more questions. But the questions you should ask are really, yeah, what is God's view of the Bible? What was the pre-fall vision of humanity?
Mm,
Did What was God's design for men and women before the fall? And then what happened with the fall and what happened afterwards? Because there's a whole lot of bad stuff thrown in there. Just in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, uh, people are that's a place where like smoke is thrown, and
mhm.
people say things that sound true but are not true. And then you get through to the entire rest of the Bible, but there's key passages where you should be able to ask questions that would actually illumine what somebody thinks, and then you can know, oh well, they're not really serious, and maybe they don't know what they're talking about. Like maybe
Yeah,
they think something that's actually just been debunked 20 years ago. Um, maybe it's bad scholarship. Uh,
yeah.
so it's a I think true Christians should educate themselves and should have gain a listening ear for some of just the small throwaway lines, the confusion that's thrown in, the statements that are made with nothing backing them up, which is
Mhm.
how I would say most of um the book that comes to mind is Beth Allison Barr's book. She just made like huge sweeping claims about things in the Bible that were
Yeah,
easily, and church history that were easily shown to be false, but most people just didn't know
yeah.
anything, and so they accepted her. They took her word for it. You should never
Mhm.
take anyone's word for it anymore.